All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGross. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have the great opportunity to spend a little time talking to someone I met at the recent Loop conference. We had a little bit of a chat then, but I was looking forward to getting a chance to talk more because he's making a pretty unique product. His name is Ed Guild, and he's sort of the mastermind behind the company Circuit Happy. And Circuit Happy makes a really cool little device, which is called the Missing Link, which really attempts to tie the Ableton Link timing collaboration software into the world of hardware that so many of us are entranced by. So with no further ado, let me get Ed talking. Hey, Ed, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. Why don't we start off? I gave us like the one sentence elevator pitch version of what you're creating, but could you give us a little more expansive version of the Missing Link product?
Sure. And thank you for having me on this podcast. It's really awesome to chat with you. So the Missing Link is at its core an analog and MIDI clock generator that can synchronize your modular synth or over USB MIDI, any class compliant MIDI device. So you can plug it into a modern drum machine that has a built-in MIDI interface, USB MIDI interface, or you can use a $20 USB MIDI cable and then plug it into anything that has a MIDI DIN port. That being said, that's not too remarkable, but what makes it cool is that it supports Ableton Link. And so that opens you up to synchronizing with iOS music apps, pretty much any desktop DJ software, and of course Ableton Live and Bitwig Studio, Reason, the most modern versions of Reason also support Link. So it kind of opens you up to your analog world to your digital world and kind of bridges in a new and really seamless way. The Ableton Link API is just an amazing piece of software that Ableton basically gifted to the industry, and it opens up a lot of possibilities. So you can show up in a room and everybody's on the same Wi-Fi network. They just link up and you hit play, and it waits. Because Link is aware of the tempo, but also your phase within, like where the downbeat is in musical terms. But when you hit play, it's not going to start right away like a traditional clock. It's going to wait until the downbeat, the start of the next loop. And that way, if I have an iOS app going and I'm doing a drum machine loop, and I want to add some modular synth bass, when I hit play on the Missing Link, it's going to wait to start outputting clock to my modular until the start of the next loop where everything is synchronized on the downbeat in the same tempo. And from that point on, because you have Link, you're aware of where you are musically at all times. And if it requires correction because of some issue, like you've fallen out of sync because you stopped your modular's sequencer and started it back up, and now it's not on the downbeat on the next loop, the Missing Link can output a secondary output that's a pulse that tells the sequencer to restart at the beginning. So it fixes itself as well throughout while you're jamming. So it's kind of a nice safety net. So while you're jamming, everything stays lined up or will resynchronize, if you will.
It's really important because, man, I've been in a number of different groups where the core vertebrae of the group was a MIDI timing sync thing flying around. And for people who are using kind of standard MIDI sequencers, that was no problem. The start and stop would take care of itself. It would always know how to reset. But for those of us that were peeling off into the analog and especially the modular world, actually being able to decode all that stuff and have the sequencers all reset properly, or if whoever's running the clock would start something up, if they're starting in the middle of a bar or something, it was almost impossible to get kind of get synchronized and get back into shape. And so it ended up being a little bit frustrating. It sounds to me like that was something that you really thought specifically about solving.
Yes, it kind of came back to, so my last job before Circuit Happy was working at this company, Isotope. I'm sure you're familiar with their products,
Yep.
and Ozone and RX. So there was a lot of modular and synthesizer people there, as you can imagine. And we would, every 6 months or so host a jam at the company. I was kind of peripherally interested. I had a couple of synths, but I wasn't like a crazy all-out synth head. But people would bring in their modular synths or whatever oddities they had, and they would all try to synchronize together. And so I kind of watched this from kind of a little bit of afar, and saw that there was usually one person who they couldn't get the clock to them because they were too far away, or there was just no more outputs. There's always one sad person that's just like off in the corner, out of sync, and
and has that face on, right?
Yeah, kind of looking around wistfully at everybody else jamming out, and they're just adding some abstract noise. So I mean, there are times when you don't need clock if you're droning out and stuff. But if everyone wants to be together and go together in the moment and have a jam, you kind of need a clock. So I kind of filed this away. I hadn't even thought about making a company yet, but it just filed away in my head. And fast forward about a year and a half, and I had a son. My son was born, and so I was on leave. And actually, up until while my wife was pregnant, at work, I kept joking that I was gonna when my son was born, I was gonna quit my job and work on my quote unquote app. Like just as like a generic, like, what are you doing? I'm working on my app. But, I had no plans. But then he came along, and I kind of hit a wall at the company. There just wasn't anywhere else for me to go. And I didn't know what to do next. And, my wife said, well, you could take care of him, and we don't have to do daycare, because daycare in Somerville, Massachusetts is very expensive. So,
sure, of course. Yeah.
So I said, you know what? That's not a bad idea, actually. So it'll give me a lot of time to think while I'm pushing this carriage around, the town, and figure out the next move. So, quit the company, started taking care of my son, Michael, and thinking about what to do. And another friend of mine ran into him at a barbecue, and he also used to work at Isotope. Funny enough, that's how we met. But he left a couple months before me to work for another company, and we got together at a barbecue, and Ableton Link had just been released for Linux, Windows, Mac. And said, both of us are out of the music space now professionally. What can we do just to kind of keep our chops going? And Link just came out for we could do something on a Raspberry Pi. So we're just going to do a project just to do a project, just to hack on the Raspberry Pi. And he is big into modular. His name is Nick Donaldson, by the way. Okay. Shout out to Nick. So Nick was big into modular and said, well, we could make a Link clock. And I was like, oh, that's cool. So I was like, I wanted to be the product designer and kind of think about those things. And he was going to write the software. And then, so we mocked it up, and then we would just show friends from time to time. And everyone kept saying the same thing. This isn't a product. Yeah. Doesn't someone make this? I was like, nope, no one makes this.
Right.
Like, well, maybe you should. So a couple months after making the prototype, I said, well, what if we just pretend like we're making a product? And I'll design a case, and maybe I can make the PC board, and you can write all the code and help me a little bit with the electronics as well. And then quickly after that, I said, you know what? Let's just make this for real. Then Circuit Happy was born. The name actually is kind of funny. The name while I was working at Isotope, I was talking with one of my coworkers, and I asked him some random, question, nothing special, and I misheard what he said. I thought he said Circuit Happy. And I went, what? That doesn't make any sense. and then both of us agreed, oh, that's a cool name. Maybe that should be like a company or something. So I immediately registered the domain.
Right.
And had no idea what I was going to do with it. But so Circuit Happy I had the domain, so I was like, oh, that works. So started designing the product in earnest, and about a year and a half after we came up with the initial idea or so, KnobCon happened, and that was a year and a half ago. So that KnobCon 7, I guess, not this past year, but the year prior, was when we actually showed it for the first time and had it for sale.
Well, one of the things I think that people have to understand is how this kind of simplifies your existence, someone's existence in a link network, because unlike, right now, if you imagine like trying to tie things together with Link, it almost inevitably involves a computer and hardware interfaces to whatever you're going to integrate with. Your box, in addition to having the way to drive MIDI or modular signals, it literally has a Wi-Fi connection. So this allows you to do a Link interface without necessarily having any other hardware connections to the Link to the Link network, right?
That's correct. A lot of people, their first question is, well, I don't have Ableton Live.
Yeah,
well,
right.
You don't need it. So
right.
In my demos, I always have to point out there's no laptop hidden under the desk. It's just this box. And so it is a Raspberry Pi Zero, and it has built-in Wi-Fi, and it can create its own Wi-Fi network if you don't have one. So it's very self-contained.
Okay.
So when the Missing Link boots up, it tries to connect to a local network. If it doesn't find a local network it knows, it creates an access point mode, and then you can connect directly to it and configure it through a web page, or just leave it like that, and everybody just connects up to that access point, and you get jamming.
Right.
So it is a tiny computer, but it's the Raspberry Pi is kind of amazing because it is a computer. It's a desktop computer from, maybe 15 years ago, power-wise, and
right.
But it's a piece of hardware too. So it's a very kind of blurry world now. Well, what is hardware? What is software?
I am curious. One of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their background and how they got to be the creator that they are. I'm kind of curious because everything that you've talked about really kind of implies an interaction with a lot of different stuff. Obviously, if you're working at Isotope, you are not unfamiliar with the music world. And so, you have some background there, but also you were clearly technically adept enough to dive into a project like this. There was circuit design, there was case design, and product design in general. And then also just literally the process of coming out of it, with a product and getting that shipped out wherever it had to go. I'm kind of curious, what is your background? How did you get into all of these different things? And what were the guiding influences for you?
Yes, that is a great question. It's been a long and winding path to get here. My professional background is actually in the graphic arts. I went to school at Rochester Institute of Technology and got a degree in printing management. And that is that you learn about all the processes involved in producing printed material, whether it be a newspaper or the bread bag packaging or whatever a T-shirt, whatever it might be, whatever ink on substrate.
Sure.
And so it's a technical background, but definitely not a computer science background, more computer operator where you're learning how to manipulate files and whatnot. But while I was there, kind of took advantage of being at the Institute of Technology and looked around and said, well, what are some things that could be useful to learn? And I really wanted to. In high school, I took one programming class and learned a very useful language, Pascal, and that basically got me at least understanding, your basic logic and loops and stuff, but not exactly a language that's used anymore. But so while I was at RIT, I found a class in Java programming for biomedical computing, where the teacher would allow me to take the class, and they were okay. I talked to the teacher and basically said what I had for knowledge, and so yeah, you can take the class and just kind of you'll do your own track because what we're doing is of probably no interest to you. So I basically learned how to draw triangles on the screen and bounce them around and do all these things. And everybody else was trying to manipulate databases for biomedical data.
Sure, right.
So I was kind of this oddity that everyone was curious what I was doing. But yeah, so I took that class, and I learned HTML. This was I went to school from '96 to 2000, so
okay.
HTML was kind of a new thing, at least relatively new, and so I learned how to code that and do some JavaScript when that started happening. And then I went to work for a company that did IT for the graphic arts, and I worked there for about a year and a half, and then that company went belly up, and then I fell into working at Houghton Mifflin for about 9.5 years. Basically a decent, cushy job, and was making school textbooks. But after 7 or 8 years, got stale. And luckily, I had a great boss, and he kind of let me stretch my wings a little bit. And I started doing some InDesign coding using JavaScript. And there's an automation engine for InDesign that allows you to generate pages through JavaScript. And so I started doing some of that, and then ultimately found a job through my network of friends at this company, Typify, where that's all I did was InDesign automation. Typify did automated publishing, so they used InDesign for producing all kinds of formulaic books like catalogs and travel guides, and it was really quite an interesting job. All this is to say, a lot of my time was not spent in professionally in the music world, but in the background, I joined a band so I could do their design work, make a website for them and stuff. That was kind of the main thing. I wanted to build a portfolio because I kind of always knew that working in production of books and things was not where I really wanted to be. And so I thought, okay, maybe I can get some design work if I show that I've made some stuff for this band, and that I also just really love their music. And I projected visuals. I used a couple different pieces of software. In 2001, I was dragging a blue and white G3 Max Tower and a projector into random small clubs around the Boston area, and everyone would always give me weird looks like, what are you doing?
Yeah, right.
And so I just basically was triggering video. They were an improvised, kind of like, they were a jam band essentially, but their framework was electronic music instead of like rock. So they wanted to sound like a DJ, but be all live instrumentation. So kind of like that challenge of looping and doing simple things, but sounding like you're playing a record, or
right.
Making a seamlessly transition between songs, that kind of thing.
Sure.
So our goal was, we played with a lot of DJs, and our goal always was to, when the DJ was done and we had jammed into their set, that no one noticed that we were playing now, that they thought that the DJ was still going.
Right.
And so I did that for a while, and then I stayed with that band for 10, 11 years. They kind of morphed into a new band in that time. But so I did visuals for a long time, and then I started noticing that my video clips, some of them had audio tracks, and that it was coming out of the speaker in my tower. It's like, maybe I could process that and mix that in.
Right.
So I got a multi-effects pedal from the bass player, Joe, and just started messing with that, and then quickly started using Ableton just as a guitar pedal board, essentially, and just running the audio through, I think I was using Soundflower, and just routing it into Ableton and adding delay, whatever filters and things to it. And eventually the video started happening less, and I was just triggering sound. And the video, as we got bigger, we never got huge, but we would play festivals with, a few thousand people at them. So we were, kind of a regional band, Northeast band that had some notes. So when we got to bigger venues, video is actually a lot more difficult to do. There's a lot more rules, and you kind of need someone dedicated to that. And I was kind of on stage doing audio stuff. And so the video kind of stopped happening because it just became too difficult, which was unfortunate because I really loved doing that, but it became harder and harder to do. And also in that time as I started getting into audio, someone introduced me to a little program called Max MSP. I'm sure you're familiar with.
Oh, I know that one. Yeah.
And that changed my world. I built a drum sampler for our drummer. He played an electronic drum kit. So it was a Roland TD-20. And so we got tired of the built-in sounds, and you can't add sounds to that brain. They're just there. So we tried Ableton Live, we tried Reason, and I couldn't get anything that was tight enough. And then I tried Max MSP, and I basically was up all night one night and just built my first patch, and I was hooked. And I'm a huge fan of Max. And so I built a drum sampler, and I had a Behringer MIDI controller that I would control it with, and we kind of became a unit. It's like he would play. Early on, I realized I can change the pitch of every sample. So I remember doing this at a gig. I just turn the pitch down a little bit, and then he turns to me and says, "Ed, speed up the sounds." I actually slowed him down. He couldn't play because he mentally it didn't
match. Right. Yeah.
I was like, "Oh, sorry," and turn it back up. And so we practiced that, and we started to do ramp downs and speed ups and make lots of crazy noises, and we made way more noise than would fit in the band. So we would do side projects from time to time and perform. And that was a lot of fun. Max really opened up a lot of possibilities, and it kind of made me realize, okay, I'm living this double life. I love audio stuff, and I love the graphic arts, but I think really what I want to be is in the audio world. And how can I get a job building Max patches or whatever else? That would be really cool. And I had a realization when I was working at Typify, where we had an internal kind of Facebook thing where you could post up. It was before Slack. They would have been using, I'm sure they use Slack now. You could post up to a channel, and there was an all company channel where people would post interesting articles about XML publishing and all kinds of interesting things like that.
Right.
And I wanted to post up a Create Digital Music post about something. I can't remember what, but so I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I said, wait a minute, they're not going to care, and they're going to just be like, Ed, get back to work. Why are you reading about music blogs? And that's when I realized, oh, I should be at a company where I could share this, and this is what they would want to see.
Right.
So, and I just kind of opened myself up tried to open up the universe to find an audio company. And I had a friend, Nick Dyka, who worked at Isotope at the time, and he had been there for a number of years. And so I just started chatting with him and saying, how do I position my resume? What do I need to do to get in there? And he's like, you'd be a good person here, but we need to look at your resume and say, why are you going to work here? Everything's in the graphic arts. And so just started getting involved in local audio things, demoing Max MSP at local audio schools and things, and just trying to get my name out there a little bit. And eventually they said, okay, we have a QA position open, and we'd like you to apply for that. So I applied, and eventually I got the job. And so I was there for about 3 years. And that was I guess you could say that was an incredible boot camp.
Sure.
The CEO there, he's really big on education, which is really a cool thing. He has this internal thing called ISO-U. He likes to introduce you to the company personally and kind of give you an overview of what they're about. And then I think his vision for that is to educate on a larger scale with the customers and potential customers. And it's a really cool idea. So yeah, it was really a boot camp. I learned so much. I knew a little bit about development from my time at Typify, but I learned a lot more because I was getting into C++ code and learning about that, and then product design and just the general industry, and learning how interesting of an industry it is.
So that's what sucked you in, right?
That's what sucked me in, working at Isotope. And that's the long answer. The short answer is, I'd say my dad. My dad, he's a electrical engineer. Spent most of his career in sales. So he worked at AMD and then Cypress Semiconductors and a couple other places. But he gave me an interest in electronics. He taught me to solder at a relatively young age, and I started getting into radio-controlled cars before I could drive real ones. And so there's a lot of electronics involved in radio-controlled cars.
Yeah.
So I spent a lot of time soldering and learning basics of circuits, but I have no formal training in circuits. I think thanks to the magic of Google, I've learned a lot.
Sure. Well, but that actually helps explain something because, in a way, one of the sort of like benefits of the modern world is whether you're talking about a Raspberry Pi or you're talking about Maximus P on a laptop or whatever, there are a lot of relatively easy ways to kind of slide into software development. And the software development thing is something I think an awful lot of people can imagine kind of bootstrapping themselves into. Hardware design, on the other hand, despite the fact that we have Instructables and makers and all this kind of stuff, I mean, there's sort of like this physicality to it that can be daunting for a lot of people. And also there is, there's this sense of like, I can watch as many thousand YouTube videos about how to solder that I want. But until I actually do a solder and I see a good solder flow instead of like just like blooping solder on a board or whatever, until I actually see that happen, there's not for myself, I make it happen. There's just not a sense that I can really get it, right? So it's interesting that your dad was there to kind of like be the leader on the hardware part of this. Yeah.
He definitely sparked the interest and gave me the basic skills to then, I could build a kit later on. And I think in college I built a preamp that never worked, but
they never do, man. They never do.
And eventually, I built a thingamaboop or whatever it's called.
Oh yeah,
funny
right.
One eye thing. You got to
with the light.
To build one of those.
Yeah, exactly.
My 3-year-old son loves that now, and so I just started building kits, and then when I had to design my own PC board for my own product, I thought, okay, well, I'm basically designing my own kit. The way I thought about it, and that made me feel a little bit more at ease, I guess. Because it is kind of a daunting task, especially when you're making a product for sale, that you're designing a board that has electricity in it, and there's very little chance of it causing a fire, but that's in my mind.
Right. Yeah.
Like, is this gonna go bad?
Is it gonna be safe? Right. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, that just makes you extra careful if you're not just brazenly diving in. So it was a lot of reading and a lot of studying online, but the basic tools were there from a young age. I guess kind of in my DNA.
Right.
It took me 30 some odd years to get to this point.
Sure. Now you've actually, I mean, in addition to just like making the circuitry, you had a lot of programming to do. Now you mentioned this guy, Nick Donaldson, who kind of was helping you make that happen. But you also had a lot of stuff to deal with. Sort of, I mean, it sounds like you must have implemented sort of like some interesting shell works in order to make all this networking sort of like auto-magically happen as well, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome that you recognize that.
Yeah, well, I looked at the documentation because I was like, man, I can imagine this being a hellhole to deal with for networking. And then I saw what you did, and I was like, oh, hell, that looks pretty straightforward completely.
Yeah, I have very few tech support questions. Every once in a while, I get someone who I think assumes, thanks to products like by Apple and stuff, where everything just kind of seems to work entirely seamlessly. They think that they just are going to turn it on and it's going to work. But I've done a pretty good job of making it fairly straightforward, and there's no like one of the things that I always have a problem with Raspberry Pi projects is usually there's a step where you have to flash an SD card.
Right.
And I don't want a customer to have to do that.
Sure.
I want them to turn it on and it's a product. It's working. So yeah, to get to there, I'm actually using a Node.js app. I found an open source project someone had done that did about 50% of what I needed, and I built off of that. They basically had a Wi-Fi onboarding process where it would show you a web page that would show you all the local networks, and you click one, enter the password, and it reboots. And then I needed more than that. I needed over-the-air software updating and some other administrative things. So I've since built a ton on top of it, but it took me a long time to find that project because it was. I'm not a networking, even though I did work at an ISP. I'm not a networking software Linux guy. Luckily, I have a brother-in-law who is, so he was very helpful. I've tapped a lot of people to make this project happen. It's definitely not just me. Like Nick wrote, 90% of the original code base. Like it would not have happened without him.
Right.
I like to think that neither of us probably would have made the project on our own. Both of us, he could have done the whole project on his own, but I think the energies and like our motivation for each other is what got the project off the ground. But now Nick is quite busy in his current day job, so I'm the caretaker of the code, but I check in with him to make sure I'm not doing anything dumb from time to time, and he gives his input on the code when I make changes and stuff. So we're still very much work together, but it's he's much less involved, but still very integral to making sure that things are I want to make sure that I'm not making any big mistakes in the code.
Right.
So my brother-in-law, Carl, he's a Linux guru. So there is some shell scripting that he helped me design for doing the software updating. And he came up with this very elegant solution that he uses in his day job. So I implemented a version of that in shell, and then kind of gave it back to him and said, "Can you make this shell script look pretty?" And he made it. And a half hour later, I was like, "Oh wow, this is incredible!" So there's a lot of people involved in this company. Kind of, I guess you could say, part time, doing little things here and there, but that have a major impact on the product. So I guess I'm the product manager and designer, and I do wear a lot of hats. But I'm I bring in friends and family to help where my shortcomings are.
Yeah, well, that sounds great. Now, I'm kind of curious about the connectivity because one of the things, it's a standalone device instead of a Eurorack device. When I first kind of heard about it, I just assumed it would be a Eurorack dump-in because it kind of has that aesthetic, and because you kind of showed it off. I think KnobCon was the first time you showed it. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, it just had all the, if you don't mind me saying, it had the stink of a modular thing going on, right? And then I was really surprised to see that it was a standalone device, but it kind of made sense also because it gave you the opportunity to really interface with MIDI stuff. The one thing I'm curious about, though, is for a lot of people that are into analog stuff, DIN connections are really important too, whether it's the old Roland drum machines or 303s, or there have been a couple of modern things that have done DIN just because of its sort of like incredibly tight timing. Is there a way to utilize DIN sync connectivity to this device?
Yes, that was, so when I released this at KnobCon, it was just an analog clock out. And actually the reasoning we made a desktop hardware piece instead of a module is you can use it with Eurorack, but you can also use it with desktop. It just gave you more flexibility. You didn't have to be in the modular world to use the box. But yeah, when it came out, we kind of made we didn't want feature creep to stop us from releasing. So I started to see maybe MIDI was a thing that needed to be supported, and so we didn't support that from the get-go because we weren't sure if it was a necessity, but people really were asking for MIDI. So luckily, because there's a USB port on it, you can plug a MIDI device into it, and I did a software update to support that. But another thing I got from my first showing at KnobCon was, besides MIDI request, was DIN sync. And I said, oh, well, DIN sync is just an analog clock with an additional analog output that goes high to tell it to run and then goes low to tell it to stop. And DIN sync can be more complicated than that, but at the core, it's just those two outputs. And I said, well, we can do that. So that was a very quick update that I did. And actually, in the modular world, Pamela's new workout, that's one module that can do the DIN sync style. It's got a run input and will operate at 24 PPQ. So those work really well together in that form. With that. So within the encoder menu on the missing link, you can change the reset output to be a DIN style run high, and the PPQ option can be set to 24, and then you have DIN sync.
Now, have you, in the variety of revs that you would have had in order to get this thing released, and then since it's released, has there been additional features in it, or have you tried to lock the feature set down pretty tightly?
Since we released,
software
updates?
Yes.
Yeah, software updates are pretty fluid. From what I learned being in QA, I'm not, I don't go crazy with updates. They're pretty controlled, but I get a lot of feedback from my customers. That's one thing I really have enjoyed and was kind of maybe a little bit surprised by, was how vocal and friendly my customers are, and excited to have kind of a say in what my product will be. I think a lot of people saw the potential and bought into it because they knew that, there could be more features that could be added. And so, I've responded to almost all my customers' requests, if they're reasonable and possible with the existing hardware. So that's kind of the one thing. The hardware you can't change, really.
Right.
But the software can change, and luckily the hardware has enough capability that I've rolled out probably, 5 updates in the past year and a half. First one was DIN sync and some other, minor changes. And then next big one was supporting USB MIDI, because people really wanted MIDI, and we just didn't see that when we were designing the product. So we weren't talking to people as much as we probably could have or should have. And so now we have, MIDI, and then there's a number of other things that people have asked for that I can't think of at the moment. But there's been like 5 or 6 updates.
Sure. Both DIN sync and MIDI, though, sound to me like they would have required some hardware modifications too, right?
Well, actually, there was one hardware modification required. When I first designed the missing link, the back panel that reveals the outputs, the analog outputs, and the USB, there's a micro USB plug just for power. It's not an actual USB port.
Right.
But there's also another USB port. And at first I didn't anticipate needing it, so I didn't cut a hole for it.
Okay.
And so, the first 20, 30 customers got, they have a panel that you can't see the USB port. So when I decided to support MIDI through the USB port, I had to send an email out to those customers and say, hey, if you want this feature,
pull out the Dremel.
No, I said I will happily mail you a new panel.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because it's a laser cut acrylic piece, so it's pretty easy for me to make. And so I made a web page to show them how to open the case up and then pop in the new panel.
Interesting.
It's pretty easy. Pretty easy surgery.
And then supporting the DIN sync for getting that DIN-like cable, do you just like have some kind of special plug that plugs into the existing 2 outputs, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I've kind of prototyped a passive adapter for that, but I've not put it up for sale.
I see. Okay.
I've been thinking of doing that because it's kind of a nice, very simple soldering kit. It's 2 jacks that are surface mount, but really easy surface mount, and then a 5-pin DIN that's through hole. So it's not a very complicated build.
Okay. Right.
So I probably should put that up on my website and make a few kits. But anybody that's doing it, I think they probably already have
something, right?
Have
something
something
together,
yeah,
right?
It's fairly easy to build one if you just get a cable that has, you have to be a little bit careful. Not all MIDI cables have
all 5 wires going, right?
Yeah. Have all 5 wires. Yeah. So you have to find a high quality one that has all 5 wires.
Sure.
And then you cut it and then slice on a couple of 1/8-inch mono jacks to the right wires. So it's a pretty easy thing, but it is definitely a little tedious.
Right. Got it. Since you stay personally connected with your user base, obviously anyone that's using Ableton Link is probably part of the bigger Ableton ecosystem. But aside from Ableton Live itself, what do you see the most use of it? Do you see a lot of people using it to interface with iOS? Do you see a lot of people using it to interface with Reason or DJ apps? Or where do you see sort of like the biggest like secondary group of users?
So when I was getting close to releasing this, I started thinking about that, and I kind of had a Venn diagram. There's a lot of people that are coming up learning on iOS apps, and they make their music in that world because they've just always had an iPad and as a kid or something, and they're coming up, and that's the world where they're making music. And now maybe they want to get into modular, and so they want to bridge those two worlds. So like that Venn diagram is in the middle of that is the missing link.
Right.
The most excited area I was thinking about was people that are building or making music with iOS, and they want to integrate with a friend who has a drum machine, or they are trying to integrate their own synthesizers or a looper pedal that has MIDI sync. I definitely have a lot of customers that are integrating iOS, or they're coming from the other direction. They are a hardware person that has an iPad app they'd really love.
They'd love to
really
try,
cool.
Sure.
Yeah, and just so it's a much easier way to integrate that than finding all the cables that you need for your iOS using a lot of adapters and stuff. So
right.
It also gives you that ability to reset, and it's a lot tougher coming out of an iPad or an iPhone. There's not a lot of cables that can give you that reset output.
Right. Right.
So, I have a lot of customers that do that. And obviously, there's a lot of customers that use Ableton Live for recording, and now they're using the missing link to kind of be their sync
sure.
to line everything up on the grid.
Yep.
And actually, something that surprised me was I have a couple of customers where link is not that important to them. It's kind of cool from time to time, but really they said, you know what, this is the best DAW clock, DAW-less clock. And
right.
It gives you that reset output, and it gives you an analog output, and it gives you MIDI, and there's a big knob with a large display that shows you the tempo.
Right. And if you happen to use Link, that's great, but just as a pure clock source, it's solid too, right? Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, we are out of time. But before I let you go, does Circuit Happy have anything on the lab bench that you can kind of tell us about? Have you got a next step?
Oh yeah, I'm staring at it right now. Yes. The big thing going on right now is I am porting to the ESP32 chip. That's by a company called Espressif, and it's a really powerful chip. It's got 2 cores in it, so it has a decent amount of horsepower, decent amount of memory, and it amazingly enough can run Ableton Link through a port. So Ableton, I don't think I'm stating anything that isn't in breach of any disclosures, but another developer is also they ported to the ESP32, and I emailed them like about a month ago because I was working on my own port, and I said, "Is this going to break the API license? Because I am modifying your API." And they said, "Yes, you can't do that." So for a second, that dashed my dreams. Mm-hmm. But they said, "We are very interested in the ESP32. We think a lot of people will hack on that.
We'll build things off that, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It really opens up a lot of possibilities. And I have a lot of product ideas based around it that maybe not quite ready to talk about, but the one that I can talk about, and the most anybody could guess, is I'm going to make a module, probably two missing link modules for Eurorack. The first one should come out, sometime early to mid next year. It's been a little slow going because the port to ESP32 went slower, but just got a big boost because I'm now collaborating with the other developer who already has a successful port. So we're doing a lot of testing to make sure his port works seamlessly for both of us. Sure. And I'm working on a Eurorack module.
That's awesome. Right. Makes a lot of sense. Well, Ed, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to have this talk and to kind of walk us through not only what you're making, but how you got to the point where making it made sense to you. So very inspiring. Thank you so much for that.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no worries. Well, with that, I am going to let you go. Have a great day.
All right. Happy Thanksgiving.
Same to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Many thanks to Ed for having that great chat. First of all, if you want to know more about the missing link, you can go over to Circuit Happy. That's circuithappy.com and check it out. He's got all the documentation there as well as some example videos. You can see it in action. Furthermore, I want to let you know that we do have transcripts. The transcripts for today's piece are up on our transcription site. Best bet is to go over to 20objects.com and take a peek around there, dig around, take a look. You'll notice that in addition to information about the podcast, I've got my modular synth mastery books are kind of cooking off there. Also have links to other information. Feel free to jump over and take a peek. Finally, as it said at the very front, this is all being funded through the help of my patrons over at patreon.com. That's patreon.com/DarwinGross. For all of it, I want to just thank you for listening, showing up every week, and I will catch you next time around. Bye.